Arizona, August 1945. The dust hung thick in the air outside Camp Papago Park, turning the afternoon sun into a copper disk that burned without mercy. Katharina Weber stood perfectly still as two American soldiers approached her children's 7-year-old Hans, 5-year-old Greta, 3-year-old Emil. The soldiers spoke in gentle tones she couldn't understand, gesturing toward a waiting truck. Her children looked back at her with eyes that asked questions she couldn't answer. She watched them climb into the vehicle, small hands gripping the tailgate. The truck pulled away, carrying them into dust and distance. 2 days later, what returned would rewrite everything she thought she understood about enemies. Katharina's story began 6 months earlier, in February 1945, when the ship carrying her from Europe to internment docked in New York Harbor. She was 32 years old, widowed, mother of 3 children who had never known peace. Her husband had fallen in North Africa in 1942. She had worked as a clerk in a supply depot near Munich, raising her children alone in a country that was collapsing around them. The regime's propaganda had told her what to expect from Americans' cruelty. Vengeance, treatment befitting enemies who deserved punishment. She had prepared her children for the worst, had taught them to be silent and obedient and invisible. Instead, the processing at Ellis Island was bureaucratic and thorough, but not cruel. Forms filled out in triplicate, medical examinations, documentation of every personal detail. Officials who looked tired rather than vengeful. A system designed for efficiency rather than punishment. Then the trains west. Days of travel across a continent that seemed impossibly vast. Through cities that hadn't been bombed, past fields that weren't scarred by warfare, alongside Americans who stared at the German prisoners with curiosity more than hatred. The children pressed their faces against windows, watching this strange enemy country pass by. Hans asked questions constantly. Where were they going? Why were the buildings all standing? When would they go home? Katharina had no good answers. She only knew they were heading to Arizona, to a place called Camp Papago Park, where German prisoners were interned for the duration. Camp Papago Park sprawled across 700 acres of Sonoran desert. Originally built to house Italian POWs, it had been expanded in 1944 to accommodate the growing number of German prisoners captured in Europe. By 1945, it held over 3,000 men in the main compound and in a separate smaller facility, 47 German women and their children. The women's section was different from the men's. Smaller barracks, modified to accommodate families, with separate sleeping areas for children. A makeshift schoolroom where the older kids learned basic subjects from whatever teachers could be found among the prisoners. A kitchen where women prepared meals using American military rations, supplemented by garden vegetables they grew themselves. Katharina and her children were assigned to Barrack 7. They shared the space with 4 other families, 15 people total, in a building designed for 8. Privacy was a memory. Personal space was measured in inches. But they had beds, they had food, they had safety from bombing and starvation and the chaos of Germany's collapse. The children adapted faster than Katharina expected. Hans made friends with other German boys, played improvised games in the small yard allocated for recreation. Greta helped in the kitchen, learning to make American-style bread that tasted wrong but filled stomachs. Emil, too young to understand imprisonment, simply existed in the moment, finding joy in small things like lizards that scurried across the barracks floor. Katharina watched them adapt and felt something complicated relief that they were surviving, guilt that they were surviving in enemy captivity, confusion about what survival meant when your country had lost everything. In July, measles swept through the camp. It started with the children in Barrack 3, spread despite quarantine efforts, moved through the women's section, with the inevitability of all contagious disease in close quarters. Hans was first in their family. Fever, rash, lethargy that was alarming in a boy who normally vibrated with energy. The camp doctor, An American captain named Richardson examined him, prescribed rest and fluids, explained in simple English that Katharina barely understood that Hans would recover but needed careful monitoring. 2 days later, Greta fell ill. Then Emil. Within a week, all 3 of Katharina's children were sick simultaneously, their small bodies burning with fever, while rash spread across their skin like stigmata. Katharina didn't sleep. She sat beside their beds, placing cool cloths on foreheads that were too hot coaxing them to drink water. They didn't want watching their breathing for signs of the complications. Richardson had warned about pneumonia encephalitis, the ways measles could transform from illness to tragedy. The camp medical facility was overwhelmed. 17 children sick, 3 critically so. Richardson and his 2 medical assistants worked around the clock, but resources were limited. This was a prisoner of war camp, not a hospital. Medical supplies were allocated for combat injuries, not childhood diseases sweeping through internment facilities. On August 3rd, Emil's fever spiked to 105 degrees. His breathing became labored, rattling in his chest with a sound that Katharina recognized from her childhood when her brother had died of pneumonia. She called for Richardson, her broken English barely coherent through panic. Richardson examined Emil, and his expression shifted to something grim. This child needs hospitalization. Real medical facilities, not what we have here. Katharina understood perhaps 1 word in 3, but she understood the tone. Her son was dying. Richardson made a decision. He contacted the camp commander, requested emergency authorization to transport 3 German children to the civilian hospital in Phoenix. Not just Emil, Hans, and Greta too, because their conditions could deteriorate rapidly, and separating them from their brother would be cruel and medically unsound. The request went up the chain of command, to the camp commander, to military government officials, to bureaucrats who had to weigh Geneva Convention obligations against public perception of giving German prisoners access to American civilian medical facilities. Approval came back within 6 hours. Transport authorized. The children would go to Phoenix Memorial Hospital. They would receive care commensurate with their medical needs. And Katharina would not be going with them. The regulations were explicit. German POW mothers could not accompany children to civilian facilities. Security concerns, liability issues, the simple impossibility of guarding prisoners in public hospitals. The children would go with medical escorts. The mother would remain at camp, would receive daily updates, would be reunited with them upon their recovery and return. Richardson explained this through an interpreter, one of the other German women who spoke better English. Katharina listened and felt the floor disappear beneath her. "No," she said in German. "No, I must go with them. They are babies. They need their mother." The interpreter translated. Richardson's expression was sympathetic but immovable. "I'm sorry. The regulations are clear. Your children will receive excellent care, but you cannot accompany them." Katharina tried to argue, tried to make them understand that Emil was 3 years old and would be terrified in a strange place with strange people speaking a language he did not understand. That Hans had nightmares and only calmed when she sang to him. That Greta would be brave and silent and internalize her terror until it manifested as something worse than measles. But regulations were regulations. At 1400 hours on August 4th, an ambulance pulled up to the women's compound. 2 medical corpsmen prepared to load 3 German children for transport to Phoenix. Katharina carried Emil, too weak to walk, burning with fever, his small body limp in her arms. Hans walked beside her, trying to be brave, tears running silently down his face. Greta held Katharina's hand with grip that was painfully tight. At the ambulance, Katharina had to let go, had to place Emil on the stretcher, had to release Greta's hand, had to watch Hans climb into the vehicle without her. The corpsmen were gentle, spoke in soft tones, but they were strangers. American strangers. Enemy strangers. The children looked at her through the ambulance's back window. Hans's face was pressed against the glass. Greta was crying now, silently, hopelessly. Emil was too sick to understand what was happening, but his eyes searched for her with the instinct of a child who knows safety lies in Mother S presence. The ambulance pulled away. Katharina stood in the Arizona heat and watched until it disappeared, until dust obscured even the memory of its passage. She returned to the barracks and collapsed on her bunk, staring at 3 empty beds, at the toys her children had made from scraps and imagination, at the evidence of their existence in a space that was suddenly horribly vacant. That evening she didn't eat, didn't speak. Lay curled on her side while the other women tried to offer comfort in whispered German and awkward pats on her shoulder. Their sympathy was genuine but useless. Her children were gone, taken by Americans to some unknown place for reasons she understood intellectually but couldn't accept emotionally. She was a prisoner. Her children were prisoners. And now they were separated by miles and language and the cruel arithmetic of regulations that prioritized procedure over a mother's need to protect her children. Phoenix Memorial Hospital occupied a sprawling complex on the city's northern edge. Built in 1935, it was modern by contemporary standards: electricity, running water, actual medical equipment beyond what military field hospitals could provide. The staff had been notified of the incoming German children. There had been ... discussion. Some nurses objected to treating enemy nationals when American boys were dying in the Pacific. Others pointed out that children were children regardless of their parents' nationality. The hospital administrator made the final decision. The children would be admitted and treated according to medical necessity, with guards posted to ensure security and prevent any public relations disasters. Hans, Greta, and Emil were placed in a private room, not out of luxury, but practicality. Keeping German patients separate from American patients avoided uncomfortable situations. 2 guards were stationed outside, rotating shifts, present to ensure the children didn't escape, though where 3 sick children would escape to was left unspecified, and to prevent any incidents. The head nurse assigned to their care was Mary O'Brien, 53 years old, veteran of 27 years in nursing. She had seen everything from gunshot wounds to infectious disease, had developed the professional detachment necessary to function in medicine, approached patients as problems to be solved rather than people to be emotionally engaged with. She entered the room expecting to find 3 enemy children who needed clinical treatment. Instead, she found 3 terrified kids who were burning with fever and crying for their mother in a language O'Brien didn't understand. Hans tried to be brave. At 7, he had internalized that men don't cry, that showing weakness was shameful. But his face was blotchy with fever and tears he was desperately trying to suppress. Greta, 5 years old, had given up on bravery. She sobbed continuously, clutching a cloth doll that was falling apart, calling for her mother in increasingly desperate German. Emil, 3 years old, was too sick to be scared. He lay in the bed barely conscious, his breathing labored, his small chest working too hard for too little air. O'Brien stood in the doorway and felt something crack in her professional armor. These weren't enemy soldiers. These were sick children who had been separated from their mother and deposited in a strange place where nobody spoke their language. She took a breath, walked to Emil's bed, first medical triage, treat the critical case before the stable ones. She placed her hand on his forehead, felt the heat radiating from him, and understood that this child needed immediate intervention, or they would be writing a very different kind of report. The next 48 hours passed in intensive care. Emil received antibiotics, intravenous fluids, constant monitoring. His fever broke on the 2nd day, slowly, grudgingly, but definitely breaking. He opened his eyes and looked at O'Brien with confusion, but without fear, too young to understand nationality, seeing only someone who was trying to help. Hans and Greta improved more quickly. Their fevers dropped, The rashes began fading. Their strength returned in increments. But the psychological distress remained. They spoke to each other in rapid German, their conversations anxious and circular. Where was Mama? When would she come? Why had the Americans taken them away? O'Brien couldn't answer. She didn't speak German. But she understood fear when she saw it, understood the particular anguish of children separated from their mother. On the evening of August 6th, O'Brien did something that violated hospital protocol. She sat on the edge of Greta's bed and sang. Not in German, she didn't know German songs. But in English, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her 50 years earlier. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. Greta didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, understood that this strange American nurse was trying to offer comfort. She quieted, listening, and eventually fell asleep, clutching her falling-apart doll. Hans watched this interaction. The next morning, he approached O'Brien and said in carefully practiced English, "Thank you." O'Brien felt something inside her shift permanently. That evening, O'Brien approached Dr. Harold Shunn, the pediatrician overseeing the children's care. She found him in his office, reviewing charts, looking as exhausted as everyone felt. "Doctor, we need to talk about the German children." Shunn looked up. "Their conditions are improving. Emil should be clear for discharge in 3 days. The other two sooner." "That's not what I mean." She pulled up a chair, sat down uninvited. "They're terrified. They're in a strange place with strange people. They don't speak English, and they're asking for their mother constantly. This is causing psychological distress that's inhibiting their recovery." Chun set down his pen. "I'm aware. But their mother is a POW. She can't be brought here." "Why not?" "Security concerns, regulations, the usual reasons." O'Brien leaned forward. "Doctor, with all due respect to security concerns and regulations, those children need their mother. Not for some sentimental reason. For legitimate medical reasons. Stress and fear suppress immune function. They'll recover faster with their mother present. You know this." Chan was quiet for a long moment. "Even if I agreed, which I'm not saying I do, getting authorization to bring a German POW to a civilian hospital would require going through multiple levels of command. It's not a simple request. Then start requesting. Make it a medical recommendation. Document that maternal presence is clinically indicated for optimal patient recovery." Chun studied her. "You're putting your neck out pretty far for enemy children." O'Brien met his eyes. "They stopped being enemy children the moment they became my patients. Now they're just children. And they need their mother." Chun considered this. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. The formal request went to the hospital administrator, who forwarded it to the military liaison, who contacted Camp Papago Park Command, who had to clear it with regional military government authority. The bureaucracy moved with surprising speed, perhaps because the request was unusual enough to prompt actual decision-making rather than automatic denial. On August 7th, authorization came through. Katharina Weber, German POW, would be transported to Phoenix Memorial Hospital under armed guard to be with her children during their recovery period. Duration: as long as medically necessary. Security: 2 guards present at all times. At Camp Papago Park, Richardson delivered the news to Katharina through the interpreter. She didn't understand most of his explanation. She only understood, "You will see your children tomorrow." She wept. The other women wept with her. This impossible thing, this mercy she had not expected, this breach in the wall between captor and prisoner. The truck arrived at the camp at 0800 hours on August 8th. Katharina had been awake since before dawn, had washed her face and hands a dozen times, had smoothed her prison-issue dress until the fabric couldn't get any smoother. The drive to Phoenix took 90 minutes. Katharina sat in the back of the truck with 2 guards who didn't speak. German, and tried to make herself small and unobtrusive and acceptable. She stared out at the Arizona landscape alien desert that looked nothing like Germany, dotted with cacti that seemed impossible, shimmering with heat that turned distance into liquid. At the hospital, she was processed through security, assigned an identification badge, briefed on rules she barely understood through an interpreter who had been hastily recruited from Phoenix as small German-American community. Then she was led to the third floor, to a private room at the end of the hallway, to a door that 2 armed soldiers stood beside. O'Brien was waiting inside. She gestured to the 3 beds where 3 children lay in various states of consciousness and recovery. Katharina stopped breathing. Her children. Here. Real. Hans saw her first. He sat up in bed, his face transforming from sick anxiety to shock to overwhelming relief. Mama. Greta turned at her brother's voice, saw their mother, and began crying so hard she couldn't form words. Engel was asleep, but Katharina moved to his bed first maternal triage, checked the youngest, the most vulnerable. She placed her hand on his forehead. The fever was gone. His breathing was easy. He was recovering. Then she gathered Hans and Greta, pulled them against her, held them while they clutched at her clothing and sobbed, and spoke in overlapping German that expressed everything they could unsay in the 2 days of separation. O'Brien watched from the doorway, tears running down her own face. The guards watched with expressions that suggested they had not expected their duty to involve witnessing this kind of raw emotional reunion. Katharina stayed with her children constantly for the next 3 days. She slept in a cot beside their beds. She helped O'Brien with their care, learned basic English medical terms through necessity and repetition. She sang them to sleep at night with German lullabies that made the American nurses pause outside the door, listening to music in a language they were supposed to hate from a woman they were supposed to see as enemy. Emil's condition improved dramatically with his mother present. He ate better, slept better, responded to treatment better. Hans's nightmares stopped. Greta began smiling again, tentatively at first, then with something approaching her old personality. The hospital staff noticed. The correlation between maternal presence and patient improvement was impossible to ignore. O'Brien documented it meticulously, noting every metric that showed the children were recovering faster than projected. Dr. Chun reviewed the data and felt validated in his decision to approve the request. Medical science, he wrote in his report, sometimes requires decisions that transcend standard protocol. The presence of the mother has demonstrably improved outcomes for all 3 patients. On August 12th, Dr. Chun declared the children medically cleared for discharge. They would return to Camp Papago Park, all of them together, accompanied by their mother. Before they left, O'Brien gave Greta something a new doll, store-bought, with a porcelain face and a real cloth dress. Greta stared at it with disbelief. Why would an American nurse give a German child an expensive gift? O'Brien knelt down to Greta's level. Because you needed something beautiful, she said. The interpreter translated. Greta hugged the doll, then impulsively hugged O'Brien. The nurse hugged her back, this enemy child, this little girl who reminded her that war made enemies, but children were still children, regardless of the flags their parents served. Back at Camp Papago Park, the story spread. A German mother whose children had been taken to an American hospital. The American nurse who had demanded the mother be brought to her children. The reunion that had transcended regulations and nationality. The other prisoners heard it as evidence that Americans, despite being enemies, were capable of unexpected mercy. That the propaganda about American cruelty had been lies designed to make Germans fight harder. The American guards heard it as evidence that maintaining humanity during war was possible. That regulations existed to serve people rather than the reverse. That sometimes the right thing was obvious, even when the rules said otherwise. In September, as the camp prepared for eventual repatriation of prisoners, Katharina received something unusual, a letter from O'Brien. It had been delivered through official channels, approved by censors, translated by the camp interpreter. Dear Mrs. Weber, I hope this letter finds you and your children in continued good health. I wanted you to know that caring for Hans, Greta, and Emil was one of the most meaningful experiences of my nursing career. They reminded me why I entered this profession, to heal, to comfort, to help, regardless of circumstances. I know you and your children will eventually return to Germany. I hope you find your country rebuilt, at peace, offering your children the future they deserve. I hope Hans continues to be brave, Greta continues to smile, and Emil continues to grow strong. Tell them that Nurse Mary will always remember them. Tell them that in America, they have someone who wishes them well. With warm regards, Mary O'Brien. RN Katharina kept the letter, folded carefully, stored with the few possessions she was allowed to maintain. She read it through the interpreter multiple times, trying to understand how enemy could write with such kindness. She wrote a response, though she wasn't sure if it would be delivered. Dear Nurse Mary, thank you for everything you did for my children. Thank you for seeing them as children first. Thank you for demanding I be brought to them when regulation said I could not. You saved more than their bodies. You saved them from fear that would have scarred them permanently. I was told Americans were monsters. You showed me Americans were people who could choose compassion when convenience would have been easier. I will tell my children about you for the rest of my life. I will teach them that enemies in war can be friends in humanity. With gratitude I cannot fully express. Katharina Weber. The letters crossed through military postal systems. 2 women from enemy nations, communicating about children and healing, and the possibility of seeing each other as human, despite the context that said they should be adversaries. Repatriation began in November 1945. Germany had surrendered, the Pacific War had ended, and the logistics of returning prisoners to their homelands commenced. Katharina and her children were scheduled for transport in early December ship from California to Bremen, then whatever awaited in occupied Germany. Before leaving Camp Papago Park, Katharina was given something unexpected. A package delivered through official channels containing 3 items. For Hans, a baseball glove and ball. American toys for a German boy, with a note in translation, so you can play American games, and remember that countries can be enemies, but children should always be allowed to play. For Greta, a set of hair ribbons, bright colors that had been impossible to find in wartime Germany. The note, for a little girl who was brave when being brave was hard. May you grow up in a world where children don't have to be brave like that anymore. For Emil, a stuffed teddy bear, soft and new. The note, for the littlest patient who recovered because his mother was there. Remember that love is stronger than regulations. Each gift was signed, Mary O'Brien and the staff of Phoenix Memorial Hospital. The children clutched these gifts on the journey home. Through the train ride to California, the ship crossing to Germany, the displaced persons camp where they waited for documentation, the eventual settlement in a town outside Munich, where Katharina's distant relatives had survived. Germany was devastated. Cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized and defeated. Katharina and her children joined millions of others trying to rebuild lives from fragments. But they had something others didn't evidence, that enemies could be kind, that nationality didn't determine humanity, that even in war's aftermath, there were people who chose compassion over cruelty. Hans became a teacher, eventually immigrating to the United States in 1968. He brought his children to Phoenix, showed them the hospital where he had been treated, told them about Nurse Mary, who had demanded his mother be brought to his bedside. Greta kept the ribbons her entire life, eventually passing them to her own daughter, with the story of the American nurse who gave gifts to German children, because children deserved beautiful things, regardless of what war their parents had fought. Emil, who had no conscious memory of the hospital, but had been told the story repeatedly, became a doctor. He specialized in pediatrics, worked in Munich, treating children who had been traumatized by various modern crises, always remembering that he existed because an American nurse had prioritized his need for his mother over the regulations that said prisoners were prisoners first and people second. O'Brien and Katharina corresponded for 30 years. Letters crossed the Atlantic regularly, becoming more than just updates. They became friendship forged in the impossible moment when war made them enemies, but circumstance made them allies in protecting children. O'Brien visited Germany in 1965 during a tour of Europe. She detoured to Munich, met Katharina in person for the first time since the hospital, met Hans and Greta and Emil as adults with their own lives. They sat in Katharina's small apartment, drinking coffee, communicating through Hans, who now spoke fluent English, talking about that August in 1945, when everything had been terrible and uncertain, but humanity had somehow prevailed anyway. "You saved my children," Katharina said. O'Brien shook her head. "I just demanded that regulations not separate you from them. You saved them. A mother's love did that." "No." Katharina was firm. "A mother's love could do nothing if you had not fought to make room for it. You chose to see us as humans. That choice mattered more than you know." They embraced. Two elderly women who had been on opposite sides of history's worst conflict, now united by shared memory of choosing compassion when hatred would have been easier. Mary O'Brien died in 1982 at age 90. Her obituary mentioned a long career in nursing, her service during the war, her dedication to pediatric care. It did not mention 3 German children in the Phoenix hospital, the mother she demanded be brought to them, the way she had chosen humanity over protocol. But her family knew. And they told the story at her funeral how Nurse Mary had looked at enemy children and seen only children, how she had fought regulations that separated mothers from sick kids, how she had demonstrated that healing requires more than medicine. Katharina Weber died in 1987 at age 74. She died in Munich, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, having rebuilt a life in a Germany that bore no resemblance to the one that had collapsed in 1945. Her last words, according to Hans, were in English, a language she never fully mastered, but learned enough of to say, "Tell Mary the first kept her letter. Tell her I never forgot." The letter was found in Katharina's effects, folded so many times the creases had worn thin, the paper fragile from decades of handling. Hans kept it, eventually donated it to a museum documenting the American POW experience, where it sits now behind glass evidence of an impossible friendship. The story of Katharina Weber and Mary O'Brien became part of the historical record. Researchers studying POW treatment during World War II cite it as an example of how individual acts of compassion could transcend systemic enmity. Military historians reference it when discussing the evolution of Geneva Convention implementation. But the deeper meaning isn't in academic analysis. It's in the simple fact that 2 women, placed on opposite sides by history, refused to let that placement define their humanity. That a nurse saw sick children and demanded their mother be present, consequences be damned. That a prisoner learned enemies could be merciful, even kind. That sometimes, in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, individual humans choose to be better than the systems they're trapped in. The hospital room where it happened has been renovated multiple times. Nothing remains of the space where Katharina was reunited with her children. But in Phoenix Memorial Hospital's archives, there's a photograph Katharina sitting beside 3 beds, Hans and Greta on either side of her, Emil asleep in her lap. An American nurse standing behind them, hand on Katharina's shoulder. The photograph was taken by one of the guards, unauthorized, technically a violation of security protocols. But he took it anyway, understanding instinctively that he was witnessing something that mattered more than rules. 2 days after American soldiers took 3 German children away from their mother, they brought her to them. That simple reversal taking, and then giving back, represented everything complicated about war. occupation, and the possibility of maintaining humanity when circumstances conspire to strip it away. The regulations said separate them. The regulations prioritized security over maternal presence, proper channels over immediate need. But one nurse said no. One doctor agreed. One bureaucratic chain of command chose to authorize mercy over procedure. And 3 children recovered surrounded by love instead of isolation. Learned that enemies could be kind. Carried that lesson forward through decades of life that would not have existed if regulations had been followed without question. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is break the rules that keep people from being human to each other. Sometimes what happens 2 days later rewrites everything you thought you understood about who your enemies are. And sometimes the impossible seems impossible until someone decides to make it happen anyway.